Good afternoon. Today's talk will be a preliminary talk on William Shakespeare's tragedy, Macbeth. William Shakespeare's Macbeth, with its full title, The Tragedy of Macbeth, was written by Shakespeare sometime in 1606 and is usually considered as one of his finest tragedies. The play begins with thunder and lightning and three witches. Next, Duncan, who is the King of Scotland, receives news that Macbeth has successfully led the royal forces of Duncan to victory. The captains, Banquo and Macbeth, while returning from the battlefield, stumble upon the witches who announce that Macbeth shall be king thereafter. Macbeth is disgruntled to hear Duncan proclaim his son Malcolm the next king of Scotland. Lady Macbeth, in the meantime, receives his letter, that is the letter from Macbeth, giving news of the prophecy, and she resolves that he shall be king. Macbeth returns and she begins working on him. During the feast in Duncan's honor, which is arranged in Macbeth's castle, Macbeth ponders murder. His troubled conscience is eased by Lady Macbeth. After a brief meeting with Banquo, Macbeth imagines a dagger pointing the way towards Duncan's chamber. He leaves to commit murder while Lady Macbeth waits in the agony of impatience. He returns shocked and bloodstained, and Lady Macbeth has to take the initiative. She leads him off while a knocking sounds at the gate, and Macduff is admitted to rouse the king. The alarm is sounded after Duncan's murder is discovered, but Macbeth's attempts to divert suspicion are not altogether successful, and the king's sons flee. Banquo voices suspicions of the new king, and Macbeth determines to be rid of him. Banquo is slain, and Macbeth hears of it during a banquet. Banquo's ghosts appear to him, and the banquet is disrupted. Macbeth repairs to the witches again and hears further prophecies. He has Macduff's family killed because Macduff has joined with Duncan's son Malcolm. They gather an army together in England and prepare to march on Macbeth. Lady Macbeth's loss of reason is shown in a scene of sleepwalking. Macbeth's followers desert to the enemy, and he is troubled by his wife's sickness. She dies, and the advancing army appears bearing branches cut from Burnham wood in fulfillment of one of the witch's prophecies. The remaining prophecy, that Macbeth is invulnerable to any born of woman, betrays him when Macduff reveals that he was untimely dipped from his mother's womb. Thereafter, Macbeth is slain and Malcolm is hailed as the new king. Macbeth is a hero for the new age, and essentially, he is also the hero of the new rich and the new philosophy. There is little to be said on Macbeth's behalf from the traditionalist or moralist standpoint. As a murderous, usurping tyrant, he deserves death, and being unrepentant to boot, he merits perhaps a spiritual damnation as well. But one factor which generates a more complex, even sympathetic response is the way in which he embodies certain volatile social tendencies. to suggest that Macbeth represents certain frightening drives in the new man, the new Renaissance man, as it were, that he is a Faustus of the active life, is not to undermine his individuality. Rather, it is to recognize a plurality of function. Political ambition, the ambition to be a king, was hardly a rarity in the Middle Ages or even when Shakespeare was writing, but it was the prerogative of feuding aristocrats. Now, with the vertical ties of feudalism loosened in Shakespeare's time, society had become, in the current jargon, upwardly mobile. The presence of an emergent bourgeois eager to buy its way into the higher reaches of the society complicated the picture greatly. Macbeth has a strongly traditional setting. Macbeth himself plays a traditional role in shifting from royal general to regicide. But by taking the audience inside the mind and personality of this ambitious usurper, Shakespeare has, amongst other things, tempered horror with perhaps the stuff of daydreams and imagination. The coveted end helps to smooth over the ugly means in the heady transition from the servant to a master. Thus, though Macbeth is enemy to order and true kingship, and with his attempts on fleance actually threatens the yet unborn house of Stuart, his very ambitions, if not their means of achievement, would chime with the dreams of a large section of Shakespeare's Jacobean audiences. In representing the new Renaissance man, who essentially is a social climber of sorts, he is rejecting the old aristocratic values which was designed to protect vested power interests. This can be a possible interpretation of Macbeth's actions. Shakespeare has performed a difficult balancing act here, setting the divine right of kings to rule against the bourgeois ethic. The triumph of traditional values at the end means that, in a sense, the middle class audience has been witnessing its own more modest failures. But ruthlessness is something which is all too easily responded to in itself, whether the perpetrator be Macbeth or Malcolm. The braver sort of spectator of Shakespeare's times might find satisfaction in Macbeth's aggressive thrusting after the unattainable, come what might. Herein lay the impetus behind the great discoveries of the Renaissance age. There is a pride, significantly deep pride, and an arrogance, but at the same time also an appealing vulnerability about this pressing forward regardless of consequences. More timid souls might enjoy identifying with Macbeth and so vicariously savoring possibilities. In their own lives, they would not be reachers after crowns, and they knew it. Even Macbeth is hesitant at first, rationalizing that success may come with no effort on his part. But this would only make it easier when it does make his move for those same timid spectators to briefly participate in his boldness. We have to think in terms of audiences with no pre-knowledge of the play's outcome. So the ending provides for them some form of a double experience. They would, with obvious moral reservations at least, rise with him until rudely awakened from their daydream, and then take satisfaction from the restoration of the old order, which both destroys Macbeth and defines their own place in the social scheme in which Shakespeare lived and wrote. Shakespeare's England was unequivocally a Protestant England, committed to a new faith in the individual and his conscience. There was a fresh mood away from medieval anonymity towards emergence from the crowd. in terms of individual achievements. Its archetypal exponent was perhaps Marlowe's Tamburlaine, the Scythian shepherd carving out a new identity from conquered empires. Macbeth sufficiently resembles him for us to recognize a common idea or a common theme, but the proliferation of titles promised to Macbeth, namely the Thane of Glamis, the Thane of Cawdor, and even King thereafter, bewilders him and comes to represent a disintegrating rather than expanding personality. Self assertion, especially noticeable among the middle classes, was a compensating factor in the 16th century decline in religious faith. New interest in biography, portrait painting, and even the writing of plays. There is no immorality that can be given a man on earth like unto plays, quote unquote, writes Nash, may be similarly explained. But a more democratic means of self perpetuation was available through one's own offspring. Soon after Macbeth, Turner's The Atheist's Tragedy, given probably by Shakespeare's own company, exhibited the murderous lengths to which the atheist would go to achieve immortality through his children. Plays like Cymbeline and The Winter's Tale show a different side of this preoccupation. But as a further testimony of the hold taken by Aristotelianism in Shakespeare's day, they probably require us to view afresh the child imagery which occurs so famously in Macbeth. Since Augustinian notions of time and eternity had begun to be rivaled by the rehabilitation of Aristotle in the 13th century, men had attempted to balance one against the other, to render unto God and Caesar what was respectively their due. This is the double standard which Machiavelli, for example, saw in all the operation around him, and which he confronts in his political treatises with their pervasive Aristotelianism. And this is especially highlighted and evident in The Prince. Shakespeare himself shows the influence of Machiavelli and created in Macbeth a very powerful Machiavellian hero, as it were. Shakespeare was essentially following Machiavellian dictum stemming from Aristotle when he made Prince John in the second part of Henry IV practice deceit on the rebels, thus keeping Hall, who is being groomed as the ideal king, free of the taint. This is not to say that Shakespeare, despite several references in the plays, necessarily ever read Machiavelli, any more than Macbeth is one of those rulers who perhaps slept with a copy of The Prince under his pillow, as it were. But the Florentine thinker's shadow was all over, thematically at least, in Shakespeare's Macbeth, despite the fact that most of us only apprehend the former at third hand, that is, Machiavelli at third hand, at least language wise, and the latter through our emotions. Macbeth is perhaps unremarkable as a Machiavellian hero in the ultimate analysis. Certainly, Machiavelli would have been unimpressed by Macbeth's ability to win friends and influence people, which he saw as a key quality in a successful ruler. And unlike Claudius in Hamlet, Macbeth finds it against the grain to mock the time with fairest show. Again, it is all very well for Machiavelli to say that the newly installed ruler or king should do all necessary killing at one fell swoop. This makes admirable theoretical sense, of course, but Macbeth has no chance of complying. Political practicalities can seldom be so tidily arranged as the plot of Macbeth repeatedly shows. Of more immediate interest at least in theoretical terms, is the distinction in Machiavelli's The Prince between virtue, virtu, and the criminal nature. Now, the word virtue, virtu, is an Italian word meaning virtue or power, and it is ultimately derived from Latin virtus, literally manliness. The word describes the qualities desirable for a man. Machiavelli, in contrast, suggests a different set of virtues than Aquinas or Aristotle, apparently with less focus on beneficence and concord and with more focus on the quality of courage. According to Machiavelli, as evident in The Prince, virtue includes pride, bravery, skill, forcefulness, and an amount of ruthlessness, coupled with the important willingness to do evil when necessary. The virtuous prince, according to Machiavelli, uses force, including murder, to secure his position and thus maintain order in the state. The criminal prince is one who takes pleasure in pointless cruelty. This is a very significant statement of Machiavelli. This is a point in Macbeth's favor initially, though Shakespeare allows us to set little store by it, and indeed the general impression of Macbeth's rule given in the English scene pushes him towards the criminal class of Machiavelli, as the foregrounded murders do not. Manliness as an aspect of virtue is rendered by Shakespeare in a way which reflects badly on Macbeth. He would, he asserts, he says, do all that may become a man, who dares do more is none. This occurs in Act 1 of Macbeth. But Lady Macbeth is apparently unimpressed. She understands that prowess alone is not enough. She demands success of Macbeth as the only true mark or quality of virtue. The one sure proof of manliness, according to her, is when you does do it, then you were a man, and to be more than what you were, you would be so much more the man. This occurs again in Act 1 of Macbeth. Again, in the banquet scene, a bit later in the play, which occurs in Act 3, Scene 4, Lady Macbeth tries to bring Macbeth to his senses with that stark question, are you a man? His attempt at a vaunting reply misses its mark. Even if you were not quite unmanned in folly, boldness would be no substitute for success. According to her own lights, Lady Macbeth is right, for her concern is with virtue, not virtue. Between the two appearances of Macbeth's ghost at the banquet, Macbeth verbalizes, strangely in a vain attempt to reduce his experience to some kind of order. He says, blood hath been shed ere now in the olden time. A human statue purged the gentle wheel. Aye, and since two murders have been performed, too terrible for the ear. This occurs in Act 3, Scene 4 of Macbeth. The first two lines of this quote looks like some notion of a historical progression, moral conduct improving as the society grows more civilized. But they are savagely, almost despairingly undercut by the next lines, by what follows as Macbeth becomes uncomfortably conscious of how his own actions have flouted all civilized restraints. Although he had been deeply concerned with the consequences of murder when pondering Duncan's removal, it is as if that experience had been lost and is now rediscovered. He says, the time had been that when the brains were out, the man would die. And there an end. This occurs in Act 3, Scene 4 of Macbeth. When we have therefore a situation in a play where Macbeth is freshly borne in upon him a realization that killing is not autonomous, its promises of finality are only an illusion. Religion, like any other collective belief, has a cohesive function in society. It definitely had a cohesive function when Shakespeare was conceiving of Macbeth as a hero of his tragedy. It is this pragmatic side of religion which is stressed by Machiavelli and which is carried forward by Shakespeare as well in Macbeth. It is noteworthy that Macbeth is, in losing his hold on religion, becomes not only spiritually but also politically damaged. Like Adam and Eve, he and his wife, Lady Macbeth, contain the potential for evil, but this is only realized when they are acted upon by an external evil objectified in the witches. The other side of the Christian equation, Christian moral equation as it were, of course, is the promise of redemption. But just as spells only bind those who yield consent, so repentance definitely requires a subjective act of will. Macbeth, like Faustus, is never able to summon this act, and hence he cannot be saved or redeemed in Christian terms. Those witches or weird sisters, as they are referred to, are never precisely defined in the play, and this is significant. Shakespeare fruitfully entangles a whole range of superstitions, from the night fears of folklore to the ultimate terror of hell and damnation. They are not necessarily malign despite their outlandish looks, but Banquo is suitably conscious and cautious in reflecting that oftentimes to win us to our harm, the instrument of darkness tell us truths. So occurs in Act 1. Macbeth, greatly intrigued by the prospect of the crown, wishes to believe in their moral neutrality. He feels his heart stirred by a breath from hell. In the Victorian critic Henry Morley's fine phrase, almost as soon as the witches vanish. The mood is still upon him when, asserting his readiness to jump the life to come, he shows that it is the law's reprisals that he fears, not God's. After which, in a rising ecstasy of horror, he proceeds to contemplate that pity which Duncan's death will arouse. But pity or not, the change of tense from conditional to future shows how he is hardening himself. Macbeth should against his murderer shut the door, but pity shall blow the horrid deed in every eye, he says. To spurn the life to come in killing Duncan is to sweep aside all authority, divine as well as human, in a defiant assertion of the self as the sole reality. But his apostasy, not yet complete, to act is easier than to shed the emotional ties of a lifetime. He is unable to reconcile himself to the deed's consequences, musingly, despairingly, on his inability to say the word Amen. Even in that scene, where he ponders the murder of Banquo, he persists in Christian modes of expression about his quote-unquote eternal jewel given to the common enemy of man, Act 3, because he lacks any alternative vocabulary. It is harder to shake free of the language of faith than of the faith and values themselves. But beyond the words which is exhibited is an extreme form of Renaissance individualism, a solipsist outlook in which there is no certainty outside the self. In the shock caused by Duncan's murder, Macbeth has only the the vaguest awareness of what it means. But he does have intimations that to assert himself is essentially to change himself. As he says, to know my deed, twere best not know myself. Act 2. Again, the perception is phrased in traditionalist terms, but what it signifies is that out of the feudal warrior is born the authentic Renaissance hero. If the lineaments are somewhat obscured by introspection, he is nonetheless of a kind with Marlowe's Tamburlaine or Chapman's Byron, who are their own gods, self-created, their ambition a supreme gesture of self-expression and self-assertion. There is a strange integrity, as it were, about their actions as they take agonized hold on their destinies. To do this destroys them, yet not to do it would be to deny their nature, to diminish them beyond tragic repair. This is why there is no question of repentance in the play. Macbeth's deeds are clearly horrible, yet they are a manifestation of that surging, questing spirit of the Renaissance, which, for good or ill, gave rise to our modern world. If Macbeth as a play is an affirmation of good over evil, that affirmation is not achieved without struggle. It is a brittle affirmation nonetheless, prone to be broken, wrenched out of a world of uncertainties, fear, like the increasingly tentative resolutions of Shakespeare's comedies. The play's medievalism is too clear for us to see and understand. Its concern with sacrilegious murder and damnation derives from traditional faith. Yet the play belongs to an era when that faith was no longer unquestioned. Like Milton, Shakespeare had to struggle to justify the ways of God to himself, and it was no facile process. What Macbeth shares above all with Dr. Faustus is a frayed edge of ambiguity, despite the apparently decisive conclusion. Whereas Faustus concerns himself with intellectual challenge to the Christian tradition, Macbeth sweeps that tradition aside in the cause of ruthless self-seeking, which perhaps is one of the features of Renaissance heroes, at least Renaissance dramatic heroes. Thank you.